All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian?
Taylor.
There was a time and place that I never wanted to talk about Metallica again. You know what I mean? I think I'm just sick of talking about Metallica. After Saint Anger, I was able to just get all of my anger out on Metallica fans, I should say, not on the album itself, because the album is great.
Fine.
Fantastic
It's
album.
fine.
Yes, it's totally fine. Exactly. But you know what? I said to myself, after looking at Metallica's discography, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if there was another Metallica album that people didn't like? And I looked through
72 seasons.
yeah, people were okay on that, but I looked through their discography and I could not find a single album that people hated. And I was like, what the fuck? This is bizarre. Like, Metallica fans, of course, are very well known for being chill people, for not being entitled, for just going with the flow on everything. So I was
Well,
like,
and Metallica are a huge band. They don't have, having more than one just absolute bomb, just absolute mockery. That's just, you don't see that with a lot of bands on Metallica's level. There's a reason they're professionals.
exactly. So I was like, we don't have anything else we could possibly talk about on Metallica's discography. But you know what? We could shit on a beloved icon. And I think you know who I'm talking about, Brian.
Well, we definitely can shit on him. Was on record as enjoying being shit on.
Yes, that's true. And by that, of course, I'm talking about Joey Belladonna of Anthrax. That's the one. That's the person
Poor
we're
Joey.
shitting on this week. Just the person we've always wanted to review on this show is Joey Belladonna from Anthrax.
Hot take, second best thrash band for me.
Yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with Anthrax. I know they were definitely the more, obviously, hip-hop fans, punk fans of the big four.
Yeah, I think it's really their vibe is they're very Brooklyn. They're the only one of the big four from New York. This is a little, we're taking a little tangent here, but while we're here, and then that they're funny, really.
Yes. But you know what else, Brian? Another act that has performed with Metallica, who has only recorded good material with Metallica from New York State, is Lou Reed. Would you believe it?
Who? Who is this?
Lou Reed. I think some people have called him Lulu before, maybe. Maybe that's like a nickname he's had at some point.
Lula. Lure. We're talking about Lulu today, guys.
Exactly. Without further ado, let's talk today about the infamous 2011 collaborative album between Lou Reed and Metallica, Lulu. Now, Brian, this was your choice for this week's episode. Why did you want us to review Lulu?
This is one of the first things I decided I eventually wanted to talk about for the pod when Taylor and I began discussing just kind of the concept for the show, the types of things we wanted to review. I know it's going to seem like I just did this because Taylor picked Saint Anger. This has been on the docket for me for a while. I bought this album when it came out. I think I bought it the day after it was released. I have that entire time had opinions on it that I've not seen reflected anywhere else in the media. I've also never been like so in love with it that I leapt up to defend it. It's just only so many hours in the day and you only have so much energy and but I think this is a pretty interesting album. I've always thought that. It is kind of a mess, and we'll get into that. But I've wanted to talk about this album for a long time because I do think that there's something to be said about it that I never see anyone say. And since, I've been listening to a lot of thrash metal and a lot of crossover last month or so, and then finally, we did Saint Anger, it just seemed like a perfect time to just do a twofer and get Lulu. I'm right in the right headspace. I've been listening to a lot of Metallica's classic period, so I thought it was a good time to dive in.
Yes, exactly. I totally agree with this. I had heard about Lulu from various Metallica fans. I believe I would call them pants-shitting retards if I was not trying to be PC, but we'll call them Metallica fans. I do not have a very positive viewpoint of Metallica fans, and the reaction to Saint Anger definitely gave me an indication at their general ability to understand art, their ability to understand creativity and experimentation, which is to say, it's the level of a toddler. They don't understand anything that requires any kind of nuance at all.
Let's be more fair. They like what they've heard. They like what they expect. I don't disagree with what you're saying, but let's level it up. That's from the idea that there's a reason that they respond the way they do to some albums. They like what they like. They have a notion of what Metallica are. They don't like having that upset, and they react very negatively to it. But the thing with that is, it's not like just Metallica fans hate this album. To Saint Anger is a joke. It is a punchline, and it has been, like Saint Anger, pretty much for as long as it's existed. And I've got some stuff to say about that, but that's just insane to me. It's insane to me that a band can be like Metallica and have two complete albums that are just written albums I'm not sure anyone ever listened to because they're so roundly mocked.
I agree for the most part of your opinion. I'm trying to be trying to hate, but I like your ability to be politically correct on Metallica fans. Because to be honest with you, as somebody who used to be a big metal fan, I've grown out of that mindset because I used to have a very similar opinion to what a lot of Metallica fans had about pretty much any popular music that wasn't metal. And I think what got me out of that was simply realizing that I was being annoying. I was being close-minded. I was being the killjoy. And I said to myself, well, you know what? How about I try listening to other things? And honestly, when I met you, that's when I started listening to other things. Because I can tell you what, even though, and to spoil my opinions on this album, I really like this album. I can't say it's my favorite album of all time, but I really like it. I guarantee you, if I had listened to this album before we met, I would have fucking hated this album.
It's so funny to me, too, to be like a super elitist, but only about metal. Not even a music snob, but just a snob about metal, which I'm sorry is like, and I know that's what it's like, bonehead music. I love it, but it's like unsubtle music for the most part. It's so funny to feel like that is the most pure genre that people have to defend.
It is really funny, and we'll get into other fan bases, not even necessarily just music, but other fan bases that are like Metallica fans in that sense, where the most ardent gatekeepers and defenders are defenders of the most entry-level thing you could possibly be in that genre. It's hilarious.
Yeah. And even within metal, this is Metallica, this huge band that were conceived to be the most, they literally, and I don't mean this derisively, Lars and James, I think, conceived of Metallica as being kind of like the ultimate metal band with the biggest appeal for metal up to that point.
And you know what? They did a pretty goddamn good job because they've sold over 100 million albums. So I think they're doing okay. But yes, without further ado, let's get into some Lulu details. So you talked about how you bought this album the day after it came out. This album was released on Halloween of 2011. It does have a parental advisory sticker on it, although I had a hard time confirming that because some copies had it, some didn't.
Mine does not.
Oh, it does not? Okay. I found some that did have it. I found some that didn't. The vinyl doesn't have it. Some CDs do. I saw some that had it, so I'm just going to say it had a parental advisory sticker just because.
Probably should. Pretty graphic lyrics.
Oh boy, we'll get into some lyrics on here. And without context, they're very funny. But within context, they're horrifying to what the subject matter of the album is.
Yeah, I'm going to say, and I love Lou Reed. I love Lou Reed significantly more than Metallica. I still think some of Lou's lyrics on this album are pretty funny.
They are. And trust me, we'll get into some lyrics. But yes, Lulu, it was performed by a collaborative effort, once again, of Lou Reed and Metallica. The personnel includes Lou Reed, of course, on lead vocals, the Continuum synthesizer and acoustic guitar. James Hetfield, of course, always the front man of Metallica. He does guitars and backing vocals, as usual. Or I should say not backing vocals, he just lead vocals, but you know what I'm saying. Kirk Hammett, who does lead guitar, rhythm guitar on Junior Dad. That's the only song he does rhythm guitar on.
I mean, really, all of the guitars on this, for the most part, are rhythm guitars.
Well, I agree, but that's what's cited on Wikipedia, so that's what I'm going to use. Robert Trujillo is, of course, the bassist on this album. This was, hilariously enough, the second Metallica album that he's a bassist on, and talk about a sophomore... No, I'm just kidding. I won't go into there. And Lars Ulrich, of course, plays drums, as always. Now, this album was released on Warner Brothers and Vertigo Records, which is amazing to me that this is a Warner Brothers release, because, oh my god. Warner Brothers would not normally release an album like this. This is a very...
It had Metallica's name on it.
That is very true. And you know what? For better or worse, Metallica are always willing to try something different. And they're a big enough moneymaker that every record label will be like, fuck it. Fine.
And that's the thing with this, too, is even when it came out, I never really understood the hate for it because it's a pretty bold experimentation. And I just don't see how you could listen to this, because my whole issue with some of the Metallica stuff that I don't like, the later Metallica stuff, post-Black Album or whatever, is that I find it kind of boring. And I feel like that's a lot of people, is that it's kind of boring. So I don't know how you could look at this after thinking that they hadn't done anything interesting or new, and at least not be impressed that they made this, because this is an insane record.
Yes. 100%. That's the one thing that even Lulu haters, and trust me, unlike Saint Anger, which has, I would argue, pretty divisive fan reactions to it, although I would say more positive than negative at this point, this album is pretty much universally hated by Metallica fans.
Well, and not just Metallica fans. Everybody hated this album. People that hated Metallica and loved Lou Reed. People, vice versa. People that just did not like this album. People hated it.
You know who loved this album, though, Brian? Is David Bowie loved this album.
Well, yeah. Him and Lou are best buds. They're friends. No, that does make sense to me. Because we'll get into sort of the reference points for this album, because I think that's pretty important to understand it. But there's some really glam rock moments on this where Metallica are really 70s glamming it up in a kind of a fun way, I think.
Oh, no, I agree. And as well, let's get into some of the production. So this album was produced by Greg Fidelman, the band Metallica, Lou Reed, and Hal Willner. Now, I'm not going to note anybody on this because I think we all know who Lou Reed and Metallica are. We're certainly going to talk about them on this episode. But Hal Willner, I looked up on his Wikipedia article. He died of COVID like a month into the pandemic. Like, he was one of the early casualties of COVID. So rest in peace, Hal Willner. Let me think here. I think the very first notable person to die of COVID that I can think of was Adam Schlesinger of Fountains of Wayne. He was like the first celebrity I can think of who died of COVID. He died like April 1st. Like, he died like immediately.
Oh,
and
a sad one.
Oh, no, of course. And I don't know if we'll ever talk about Fountains of Wayne again on an episode, but I fucking love Fountains of Wayne. So rest in peace, Adam Schlesinger. Great band.
I don't know if I have anything to say about them in the context of the show, but yeah, they're a great band.
100%. So rest in peace, Adam Schlesinger. And of course, he wrote a bunch of TV show themes as well. So he had plenty of money from that.
He wrote That Thing You Do.
Yes. And I think he also wrote the theme song for like How I Met Your Mother and like a bunch of other like big CBS shows and stuff like that.
I did not know that, but that would make sense.
And you're talking about how this album is very bizarre and weird. Well, here's the thing. If you don't like bizarre and weird, get ready, because the length of this album is 87 fucking minutes long. So talk about a bizarre, weird, long fucking album. You got it right here.
This is like a classic concept album. It feels like an early 70s concept album. It's big. It is bloated. I like this album. I think it works, but it is a big, conceptual, ambitious nightmare of an album. It is unwieldy.
It is, although even more to spoil my opinions, because I just really want to talk about the track listing. But I can tell you what, even though it is bloated, it's enthralling. There's just something about this album that's extremely fascinating to me that I just can't hate on it. There's nothing about this album I can hate on. Even when, and we'll get into the last song on this album, so spoilers again. The last song on this album is 20 fucking minutes long. It is nearly 20 minutes long.
And I think, again, one of the things when people talk about this album, I'm going to tell you, the first time I heard a clip from this album before I bought it, when everyone was making fun of it, I liked 80s Metallica, loved the Velvet Underground at this point. And so, obviously you're like, Lou Reed and Metallica, huh? Kind of interested in that. I hear people making fun of it, but I'm kind of like, I don't know. I'm still kind of curious about this. I hear a bit from The View on some radio station, just like a preview snippet of it. And then the DJ, who's just like a rock radio DJ, is going, what is that? What is going on? This is just some old guy talking like he's doing slam poetry. And the thing is, I'm not going to say this is Lou Reed's best work, but that to me at the time, and keep in mind, big Velvet Underground fan at this point, I'm thinking like, oh, this is just some dumb, like, hard rock DJ who doesn't know who Lou Reed is. Because if you're going to criticize Lou Reed for something, I mean, talk singing is just kind of what he does. That's kind of my feeling about this, is that a lot of the initial opinions were people who maybe didn't have context for Lou Reed or what he would be doing. So they're just like, why would Metallica do this?
Oh, no, for sure. Like, if you're a Metallica fan, just listening to Master of Puppets and Injustice for All day, I would think to myself, what the fuck is this? But at the same time, that's what I love about Metallica. They don't give a fuck. They're going to do what they want. They're going to collaborate with who they want. And if you don't like it, who cares? They're still worth $100 million each member anyway. So they don't give a fuck what you think.
You just described Kanye West.
That is very true. Although I will say that up until the various goings on that he's done in the last year or two in regards to his speech, he was pretty critically acclaimed.
No, Kanye made amazing music. Like, what are we going to do about it? We're going to pretend he didn't?
I can tell you what, people have certainly tried.
That is similar to me to saying that Metallica didn't make some great music that was heavily influential. In its level of influence on the culture and music in general, those are both futile arguments that people can try to make all they want.
Ooh, man, fun stuff. And getting back to the production. So I was not able to find a production budget for this album, unlike Saint Anger. However, one thing I was able to find was as of March of this year, Lulu has sold 280,000 copies worldwide. So definitely not a super well-selling album from the perspective of Metallica. But once again, this really isn't a Metallica album. This is more of a Lou Reed with Metallica album.
Yeah, it was always intended to be a Lou Reed album with Metallica as his backing band. Now, obviously, because Metallica are such a big band and they have such a distinct sound, that's not really possible. But I think it was initially intended to be perceived as a Lou Reed album, like a project by him involving Metallica. I don't know if that would have made people more open to it or view it differently, but I do think maybe it should have.
I agree, because like the thing is that when it comes to people's opinions on this album, you really only get Metallica fans' opinions on this album. That's just the reality.
So I'm going to say I spend a lot of time talking with people about music. And in kind of the circles I am, both on the internet and, in my waking life, Lou Reed is someone that comes up and is a much bigger common thread in those than Metallica. I mean, they both are. And I'm going to say, even people I know who love Lou Reed, love Velvet Underground, very cool people who like bands like Swans or like no wave music, all the shit that on paper this might be, have a thread with, they all hate it too. I don't really understand why, but I'm going to say everyone hates this album.
Well, not everybody hates this album, Brian. I think there's a couple people in this world who may love it. And I feel like, well, to spoil it, once again, it's us. But also, Brian, we're in the same company as David Bowie. Come on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, one of the most beautiful souls that ever walked this earth, David Bowie.
And then speaking of people's opinions, so on Amazon, this album has a 3.8 out of 5. And before we get into the Amazon reviews, because obviously we get to that at the end of the show, there were actually not that many negative reviews for this album on Amazon, which I was kind of shocked by.
I mean, like we've said privately, not on the show already, and I think you agreed with this. I don't think very many people have actually bothered to listen to this album.
So I agree with that to a certain extent, but once again, this album did sell 280,000 copies. That is a lot for like a Lou Reed album in like 2011.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, like, I kind of get the feeling that I don't know how many people actually like sat and listened to this album after it became a meme.
That is true. And once we get into the actual track listing, the thing is that I have a theory on why so many people hated this album in particular is because of the memes. There were a lot of memes about this album, particularly the I am the table meme. And granted, it's kind of funny, obviously. They Photoshop James Hetfield's face on a table and he's just screaming, I am the table. It's funny, sure. But it's like one of those things where, like Breaking Bad, for example. I know I always bring it back to Breaking Bad, but there is relevancy here. A lot of people post Breaking Bad memes on like various parts of the show that are incredibly emotionally impactful. And then people will be like, the face when she keeps sucking after I nut. And it's like Walter White looking shocked or whatever. And like in the context of the show, that moment is like horrifying. But obviously it's like, haha, funny meme face. And it's like the same thing here. Like there is incredibly like just awful subject matter to this album. I mean, spoiler alert, this album is about a young woman, presumably a prostitute, who goes to the big city to find a less boring life. She gets sex trafficked and murdered by a serial killer. That's what this album is about. And people are just like, haha, the table, haha. And it's like, come on, man. There's way more context to this shit than that.
Well, that brings us to a wider point that I think is important. The subject matter is very serious, but it's also very Lou Reed. He's very caustic and kind of detached about it. And I think that ties in with another reason I think you're right. People don't like this album because it's easy to meme on. And once it became memes, that became more important to people than actually considering the album to any degree.
Absolutely.
And then there's this thing, I know I sound really pretentious and stuck up when I say, oh, it's because all these Metallica fans don't know who Lou Reed is. But I feel like if you do, then if you know Lou Reed to any degree, you shouldn't be surprised that he made this difficult album that's kind of jarring to listen to and doesn't necessarily sound pleasant, because that's what he's always done. I mean, like, he's like one of the first people to do like avant-garde rock music. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say Lulu is the pinnacle of avant-garde rock, especially coming from the same guy that wrote Heroin or whatever. But it shouldn't be this great break in what he's done in the past. It is for Metallica, sure. But when you see Lou Reed's name on it, you should be thinking, well, that's kind of the idea, is that we're going to get to see Lou Reed is going to bring an avant-garde side out of Metallica that maybe we haven't seen before. And I would argue that it might not be the best thing either of them have ever done. It sure isn't. But it sounds pretty much like you'd expect.
No, I totally agree with that for sure. It's good. Once again, it is a good album.
Particularly, like, I think Metallica are great on it. If someone said to me, hey, I don't really think Lou Reed is great on this, I don't agree. I love Lou Reed. I love his voice. I think the lyrics are iffy. There's parts where they're really on, and there's parts for me where they aren't. I love the theme and the concept. I think that's a great concept album premise. This is based off of a play or a series of plays by someone else, if I'm not mistaken, that Lou Reed was a fan of.
Yes, I will mention that in the trivia, so let's just wait a little bit before we get to that point. But I do want to talk about it. And getting back to user reviews here, on Rate Your Music, it has a 1.99 out of 5, which is actually higher than Saint Anger, which I was kind of shocked by.
I'm not. I mean, I liked Saint Anger. If you like one track on this album, you're going to like them all. And if you hate one track on this album, you're going to hate them all.
That is a good point, because they all do blend together, and not in like a bad way, but it is once again a concept album.
It's like an opera, yeah.
For sure. And then let's get into some trivia here. So the first piece of trivia I have here is this was the last album of Lou Reed's career. Lou Reed would die just 4 days shy of 2 years after this album came out. He passed away on October 27, 2013.
One of the great American songwriters, one of the architects of rock and roll. I don't know, what else can you say? Most of the music that we all love, if you love like hardcore punk, if you love, you know, some twee indie pop like Belle and Sebastian, if you like REM or you like the Buzzcocks, none of that exists without Lou Reed directly.
If you like Theory of a Dead Man, thank Lou Reed.
They did a cover of Sister Ray with that guy going, she's busy sucking on a ding dong.
Is that actually a real thing?
Oh, yeah. Actually, we'll talk a little bit about Sister Ray, because I think that's like a heavy reference point for this album, and I'm excited to draw those parallels up. But yeah, one of the recurring lines in that album is, she's busy sucking on a ding-dong.
Oh, man, that rocks. The next bit of trivia I have here is Lulu is a double album that conceptually is based on the two Lulu plays by the German playwright Frank Wedekind, who lived from 1864 to 1918. And getting into a little bit of the Lulu plays, the first one was called Erdgeist, which is German for Earth Spirit. And the second play, and this is German, so please excuse my German, Die Brüche der Pandora, which is German for Pandora's Box, which came out in 1904. Originally conceived as a single play, the two pieces tell a continuous story of a sexually enticing young dancer who rises in society through her relationships with wealthy men, but who later falls into poverty and prostitution. The frank depiction of sexuality and violence in these plays, including lesbianism and an encounter with Jack the Ripper, in parentheses, a role that Wedekind played in the original production, pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable on the stage at the time. And in the story, once again, just spoilers, TLDR, the character of Lulu becomes a prostitute, is sold into slavery, and is killed by Jack the Ripper. So that is essentially what this album is about, and I would say most of the songs relate to that pretty heavily. There's one song I think does not relate into that super duper well, but I think the rest of the songs very much are based on that overriding concept.
I mean, you can follow that story pretty clearly in this album, but it's not necessarily about that narrative, I would say. It's more about being in the headspace of that woman and kind of feeling her boredom and her kind of like very dead feeling and like looking for some sort of way to feel alive through all this violent sex and this degradation and things. It's really existing in her thoughts, which is another reason that I think kind of like this bludgeoning music and atonal vocals work pretty well.
Yes, I agree. I will definitely amend my point to that. It is very much like what this woman's thoughts are as a lot of this is going on. I will agree with that for sure. And then, once again, I mentioned earlier, but as of March 2023, Lulu has sold 280,000 copies worldwide. And the last little trivia I have here, and I don't know if it's necessarily trivia, but it is Lou Reed and Metallica's opinions on the fan response to this. And Brian, I want you to hear this because it is fucking hilarious. Lou Reed stated that Metallica fans threatened to shoot him due to the collaboration on Lulu. In response to this and the overall negative reaction to the album, Reed commented, quote, "I don't have any fans left. After Metal Machine music, they all fled. Who cares? I'm essentially in this for the fun of it," unquote. Metallica drummer Lars Ulrich also noted that the negative reaction to Lulu and stated that he wasn't surprised by the criticism due in part because, quote, "In 1984, when hardcore Metallica fans heard acoustic guitars on Fade to Black, there was a nuclear meltdown in the heavy metal community," unquote. And also noted that Reed's poetry is not for everyone. Talking about the negative reactions, frontman James Hetfield expressed understanding of, quote, "fearful people," unquote, who are, and this is my favorite thing that I read on the Wikipedia article, quote, "typing from their mom's basements that they still live in," unquote.
What an asshole. Like, I mean, come on, man. And I like this album, but it's like they knew making this that it was going to piss people off. Lou Reed especially, but everyone involved knew.
I'm sorry, but at this point, because this album came out about 12 years ago, so James Hetfield would have been almost 50 years old. A nearly 50-year-old man calling their detractors basement dwellers is really funny to me.
I think this is a good place to get into kind of Lou Reed and Metallica, respectively, what I think the kind of baggage that they were bringing to this project, if that's all right.
Well, I'm going to finish this real quick because I'm almost done with this part. And once again, James stating that the band needed to spread our wings and try something new, while Reed stated that the album is for, quote, "literate people," unquote.
That's such a fucking Lou Reed thing to say. He's so fucking cool. There's this interview, I think, from the 80s, where the interviewer asked him, "What's the last book that you've read?" And Lou Reed said, "I read more books in a week than you read in a year." Such a prick.
That fucking rocks. And Robert Trujillo spoke about the album saying, quote, "Love it or hate it, it was definitely something that we enjoyed and we embraced," unquote. And you know what? I think it's interesting because I've seen a lot of video interviews where Metallica and Lou Reed talk about the making of this album. And a lot of people in the comments are like, "Oh my God, Robert Trujillo just looks like so bored and lost and blah, blah." And I'm like, okay, first off, this dude was in suicidal tendencies. I mean, come the fuck on. A band which their most famous song is a guy talking through a mental health crisis. I mean, come the fuck on. That's not that different than this album.
When you break it down that way in its components, it basically is.
like people are like, "Oh man, this Robert Trujillo guy just comes from thrash. He doesn't know anything about." I'm like, fuck you. This guy knows about Lou fucking Reed. People are just assholes about this, and I don't know why in particular they zero in on fucking Robert not understanding it. I don't know. There's something weird about that to me.
I think it's because he's the newest one, and he was probably quieter in those interviews because, again, he's the newest member. He's probably holding back for the other guys to talk. And, like, he might have been taking a back seat on this album because, again, he's only been in Metallica for, at this point, 8 years or so?
Yes, I believe about 8 years, yeah.
Rob Trujillo, he knows Lou Reed. I mean, arguably as much as Lars does. And Lars seems to be, I would say, like a huge Lou Reed fan in his own way.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they were talking about how, like, well, I should say Lars in particular. We're talking about how him and fucking Lou Reed would have dinner and stuff and talk all the time and hang out and stuff like
Lars, he's into modern art. I mean, I think they were all into punk, but I always got the impression that Lars was the one that brought in, like, the Discharge and the Anti-Nowhere League influence and things and kind of the weirder punk. So, I mean, I absolutely think that's him.
Oh, for sure, 100%. I mean, James was always into punk too, but yeah, Lars was definitely the primary punk guy. All right, without further ado, let's get into the track listing here. Now, the first track here is Brandenburg Gate. I really like the lyrics on this song. Now, I will say it starts off with a line that I think has become kind of infamous that's associated with this album. Brian, do you want to just go ahead and say what that opening line is for this album?
Let me see if I can do it without looking. "I would cut my arms and tits off when I think of Boris Karloff and Kinski."
Yes, "In the Dark of the Moon." That is the very first line of this album. And I can tell you what, if you weren't paying attention and you just turned this on like, hey, here's the new Metallica album featuring Lou Reed, because people didn't obviously associate it that way back then, they would think, what the fuck did I just hear?
And that's what I think happened. A lot of people heard this and they almost heard new Metallica album and they kind of ignored that it's a Lou Reed project that they're working on. I want to say something. I bought this album when it came out. I listened to it in a car full of my like rocker friends with 4 other people who all loved punk rock, who loved the Velvet Underground, and they all hated it. And I kind of was like thinking, I don't see what's so bad about it. And I kind of didn't say anything because I didn't want to get into an argument or anything there. But even when I heard that first line, I remember thinking, I think that's a cool fucking line. That's exactly the type of weird, stupid, pretentious lyric that I would like. I still think it's awesome. And I think it sets up the album perfectly.
It does 100%. And also the next line here, it made me dream of Nosferatu trapped in the Isle of Dr. Moreau.
Island of Dr. Moreau.
And that's also a great line. Like, it flows all very well. It gives you this, like, sense of, like, disassociation, like, almost immediately. I think it's actually, like, a perfect way to start this fucking album.
And it puts you right in the time, right? Which is, like, 1910s. Kind of, like, smoky club room, you know, glitz and degradation thing.
Yeah, I really love the lyrics on this song. I also really love when James just yells small town girl in the background. It's just so cheesy. I love it.
I feel like in these first couple tracks, because James kind of vocally, he drops out after a while, but he's really trying to find a way to work his voice in. His voice is great. It's great whenever it's here on this. But I do find after a while, like, it's pretty clear that these lyrics were not meant for a voice like his.
No, that is a really good point. This is, once again, a Lou Reed album featuring Metallica, and it's very clear on pretty much everything outside of most of the instrumentals. Because, of course, Lou Reed does do acoustic guitar and the synthesizer, but otherwise than that, you know, obviously drums, bass, rhythm guitar, lead guitar, that's all Metallica otherwise.
And it sounds very much like Metallica. That's one of the reasons that I don't really understand people saying that this is such a bad album, is that Metallica are really pulling their weight. Like, this track, they come out, basically, it's slow, it's kind of sludgy, it's almost like stoner metal. It actually, to me, kind of sounds like the Smashing Pumpkins on Brandenburg Gate, but they're definitely, like, finding a way to make Lou Reed and his history kind of work in the Metallica sound.
Yes, very much so. And you know what else this song sounds like? It sounds like a small town girl living in a lonely world. She took the midnight train going anywhere. But honestly, is it just me or does this song kind of sound like Don't Stop Believing a little bit?
Well, so I almost wonder if, like, cause it sounds like every kind of mid-tempo hard rock ballad. Because you know what it also kind of reminds me of? Not that it sounds like it, but there's something about kind of the riff and the vibe is Semi-Charmed Life. Next time you listen to Brandenburg Gate, just sort of hum do 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 do. Very 90s college rock vibes on this track.
Yeah, very much so. Like, the thing is that this is not necessarily a new theme to have in music. A uninterested, unsatisfied person goes to the big city or goes somewhere else or etc. to try to find meaning. That's a very common theme throughout basically all popular culture. But I did think it was funny when I just heard Small Town Girl, because the first thing I thought of was living in a lonely world. And that was the first thought in my head.
Your brain screams for him to finish it.
But yeah, so once again, this song is very much Don't Stop Believing, but in the perspective of the girl in that song. But it doesn't go anywhere positive, and we'll get into that in some of the later tracks. But I will say, once again, this is a great way to start this album. It really puts you in the headspace to just listen to some fucking turn of the 20th century German opera as interpreted by Lou Reed and Metallica.
I mean, truly. That's the thing, is they were very upfront about what this album was, so I don't know how people were so taken aback by it.
Well, to be fair, Metallica fans would be taken aback if you dangled keys in their face, then put it behind your back. They'd be like, where are the keys?
Where'd it go? Where'd they go?
All right, next track listed here is The View. Now, this is the song that if anybody actually listened to this album, which I don't think 95% of Metallica fans even tried listening to this album in any kind of, like, purposeful trying to listen to this album. But this is the single off this album. The music video was directed by Darren Aronofsky, and the single was released on December 3rd, 2011, so about a month, I should say about 5 weeks to about a month and a half after this album was released. And once again, this is a great song. I really love it. Lou Reed is still very much getting into the sort of atmosphere of the album. The lyrics are not nearly as vulgar as the first song.
Because it's the single.
Exactly. And they wanted to be a little bit more mainstream here. And this is the song with the very infamous line, "I am the table."
Which is funny out of context. Like it is funny hearing James say that. It's like, what, dude?
Yes, exactly. And well, I mentioned a possible connection with "I Am the Table" to you a couple weeks ago. So, obviously, we know Dave Mustaine. He wrote all of Metallica songs. I mean, he's really the reason Metallica got famous in the first place. I mean, let's be real here.
Yeah, no,
And
he formed the band. He dragged them over the finish line.
he was the guy that always made sure that all the gigs were signed. He was always the one that was the most sober. He never did any drugs. He never stole anything. He was
He made
never
it to all of the gigs.
He was never a psycho. He was always the most normal person in Metallica when he was in Metallica.
And that's why when he finally left of his own will, his band became even bigger.
100%, yeah. But the thing is that Dave Mustaine was born in San Diego, California, and the town that he's from is called La Mesa, which in English is table.
I am La Mesa.
Is he trying to say, I am the table, I am Dave Mustaine?
I am where Mustaine came from.
Exactly. That's perfect. But no, in all actuality, though, this is once again a really good song. I think that James' vocals add a lot of texture to this because he's yelling these lyrics, and I fucking love it.
Very different delivery for him. One of the things I think on these first couple of tracks where James vocally is very present is I do kind of feel like they were thinking like, well, we need to let this be a little bit more of a Metallica album. Because as the album goes on, Metallica's presence becomes entirely musical. But here they're kind of trying to make these, more into Metallica songs. Like musically, The View is almost just could be a Metallica song of this era.
Yeah, it really could be. It is definitely the most mainstream of the songs in this album, outside of maybe one. But I can see why they made this the single, because it is the most accessible song on the album.
And then, I mean, I like all the tracks on this album, but I would say that this track and then the one right after, those are the two where I'm like, oh, actually, musically, this sounds like Metallica.
Yes, very much so. And then as well, the lyrical themes. So now we're starting to get into some of the more seedy elements of what I assume the stage play is about. It's talking about how this woman's basically selling herself to, people who despise her and want to see her just be fucking belittled and degraded. And it gets dark. And obviously, this is from the perspective of the young lady, too. So I'm sure she's probably not having a very positive view of herself. Once again, The View. But, this is a beginning to get into the darker side of this album. And we're only the second song in, really.
I mean, like, there are things about these lyrics that really work for me. I love Lou Reed just as a lyricist. There are times when it doesn't work, but the reason that some of it doesn't throughout the course of the album is because Lou Reed, he really does not believe in like subtext a lot of the time. A big thing, even at the start of his career, is that what made him so radical as like a pop rock songwriter was that he was writing songs about sadomasochism and heroin and murder and rape and like mutilation in these rock songs, and it was just laid bare. This is a pretty direct continuation of that for him. The moments where it doesn't work, there are times, particularly on the next track, but a little bit throughout these first three tracks, where I feel like Lou Reed is very much like being like an edgy guy, like his idea of an edgy guy, which is kind of like a beatnik, something that would have been very edgy in the 60s, but sort of now is a little bit like, all right, then.
Yeah, very much like an older boomer, like early silent generation guys sort of view on what like transgressive art is.
I'm gonna freak out the squares, man.
Which, to be fair, Gen X definitely did some of that too. So, all right, let's get into the next song here, which is Pumping Blood. And I really like the riff on the first verse. And this song also has one of my favorite lyrics on the album, which is "Waggle my ass like a dark prostitute." When he says it several times, "Would you like me if I waggled my ass like a dark prostitute?"
That's one of those lyrics where like it makes me laugh. And there are moments lyrically here where I feel a little embarrassed for him, because it's like, well, to me right now, when you say stuff like "waggle my ass like a dark prostitute," you sound more like a goofy old guy who's like, I'm gonna write some sick shit.
To be honest,
kind of like, all right, Grandpa.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I thought he said "waggle my ass like a dog prostitute," and I'm like, what the fuck?
Like a dog prostitute. But musically, I think this track really works. This is like almost like a thrash song. This is Metallica really going, okay, we're going to find a way to be really heavy on this album every once in a while. And I think it's important to look at kind of where I think Metallica are coming from. So Lou Reed and Metallica both obviously have two very different trajectories, different histories, different audiences, with some overlap over the decades. So Lou Reed is no stranger, obviously, to doing these really confrontational art piece albums. These albums that he designs for maximum repulsion of like his audience. He's done that multiple times, most notoriously with Metal Machine music. Metallica have done that at least once before accidentally, have just repulsed a large chunk of their audience. But they're coming from these different, I think, places as far as the types of artists they want to be viewed as. So Lou Reed, because he's very much like of the beatnik tradition, he wants to repulse his audience. He wants to be an artist that upsets his audience. Whereas I've always gotten the impression that Metallica sort of have a crisis about being viewed as artists. And here you see those two impulses kind of meet, and I think that's why this album exists. Metallica are jumping to do this thing for Lou Reed, because then they get to do like art, is what I presume. They feel like they want to do this serious art piece. And I feel like Lou Reed kind of being famously Lou Reed and just kind of not caring about his fans and doing this basically for fun. It's like, yeah, I'll do a fucking album with Metallica. You know, maybe my guess is not being particularly like interested in Metallica's music, but interested in the idea of working with such a different band that's going to provoke such a response.
No, 100%. Like, the thing is that I think of is you had a theory, and I think you just espoused upon the theory a little bit, that you think to a certain extent that Lou Reed did this album with Metallica to not only troll the fans, but also kind of to do a like meta troll on Metallica themselves.
Kinda.
Yeah, you said essentially that Lou Reed doesn't see necessarily Metallica as artists on his caliber. Was that essentially what you were saying?
Yes, I 100% believe that.
I could possibly believe that too, because Lou Reed definitely, in a lot of interviews and a lot of sort of material that he's made, he was an older boomer who was part of that like sort of beatnik style, part of that like proto hipster fucking like lifestyle.
Oh yeah.
In fact, I think the actual OG hipsters were from the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, where like the actual origin of the term came from.
It meant pedophile.
Oh. But yeah, you know, that's not necessarily a uncontroversial viewpoint. And in fact, you know who kind of agrees with you, Brian?
Who?
Anthony Fantano agrees
I
with
hate
you
that
on
guy.
that.
That's like my nemesis for music reviewing.
He agrees with you mostly, although he thinks that Metallica and Lou Reed were pretty much equal collaborators on pissing off people, whereas obviously you view that Lou Reed basically had the upper hand no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, I think Metallica were aware they were going to piss off people. And I feel like this is confirmed when you look at the finished product. I think Lou Reed came in saying, I have this transgressive poetry play concept album project. I'm going to get this giant fucking rock band, this cock rock band to make the music for it. And I'm going to say, I like Lou Reed a lot. I kind of don't think that he's giving this vocal reading his all. I know it's reciting poetry, but I kind of do think he's not going for it, you know, which is fine. He's reciting poems and that works for what this is. Metallica are going for it musically. They are really trying to like make this weird Lou Reed experimental project work for them. And I think that you can see what they did, I think, is they looked at Lou Reed's past body of work and they said, where does Metallica fit into this? Where can we sort of like be building on a thing Lou Reed did so we can fit together? And I think the answer to both of those things, and this might lead some credence to your idea that Metallica were in on the troll, are the Velvet Underground's album White Light, White Heat, which is basically a proto-punk album. It's instead of folk rock like the first VU album, it's this distorted guitar, very bluesy. Songs are 6-7 minutes long, kind of droning chords, just shouts and feedback and distortion. And it ends with Sister Ray, which is a 17-minute song that's basically built around one riff. Proto-metal album, definitely a proto-punk album, pretty well regarded, early noise rock. Probably don't need to explain how that was probably a reference point for Metallica when they were making the music for Lulu.
I do want to go back a little bit to your point about Lou Reed not giving it his all. So once again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, he only died a little less than 2 years after this album came out. He probably had lung cancer at this point because that's ultimately what took him out was lung cancer.
He absolutely did.
He might not have been able to put in his all.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm not mad at the guy. I'm just calling it like I see it when I listen to his vocals. I 100% think you're right about that. But for whatever reason, we are not getting the best Lou Reed. And there's an argument to be made that as a vocalist, even the best Lou Reed isn't necessarily built for bombastic hard rock.
Oh, no, for sure. Let's get back into the track just a little bit, Pumping Blood. Now, this is a song that is very clearly about Jack the Ripper. I mean, it's describing in pretty gory details, like literally, about him murdering prostitutes.
Yeah. Well, and then, Pumping Blood itself, there's a few different ways to take that. With Lou Reed writing it, I'm inclined to assume it's like a gross sexual line, too.
And, well, to be fair, Jack the Ripper definitely did that because his whole thing was cutting up women and seeing their organs and just doing gross things with them. That was Jack the Ripper's whole thing. It's weird to me that he is...
I don't like it. Personally, I don't like that. I want any girls listening to this show, I want you to know I would never do that to you.
100%. Any women who listen to this show, I want you to know that when we have sex, I want you to be alive and completely intact.
Yeah, I want it to go on record right now. Anti-Jack the Ripper podcast. Because speaking for myself, Taylor, I don't know about, free country, but I'm anti-Jack the Ripper.
And also, this song has one of the funnier lyrics as well. Again, I will swallow your sharpest cutter like a colored man's dick.
And again, this is embarrassing. This is such a old 60s poet guy going I'm gonna say some edgy shit. And I'm not offended by these lines, by the way. I love Lou Reed and I love him when he's offensive. But it's just kind of all right, dude. With the lines like that one in particular, I find kind of embarrassing. It's a little undignified for Lou Reed's final album to me.
Exactly. All right. And with those lyrical themes, let's get into the next song here, which is Mistress Dread. Now, the lyrics of this song are wild. So the lyrics of this song are about a woman who I dated at one point. No, I'm just kidding. But I will say, some of the lyrics in here are I wish you could tie me up and beat me, crush me like a kick, tie me with scarves and jewels, bloody gag to my teeth. I beg you to degrade me. Is there waste that I could eat? Please spit in my mouth. I'm forever in your swirl. No bullshit. I dated a girl who is exactly like this. And it's rough, man. I'll just say that. It's fucking rough shit.
An actual thing about this that a lot of people don't know is that Lou Reed actually bought these lyrics from Robert Kelly, who originally wrote them and intended to have it sung by one of his female proteges. So Lou Reed repurposed it to fit it into the Lulu album. But it was originally an R. Kelly song.
Oh, man. But yeah, that definitely brought back some memories when I was 27.
This is a nasty song, but the lyrics in this are not embarrassing to me. It works here. It's stuff like that, the colored dick line in the previous track. Stuff like that bugs me, but it's the wordiness and I think the half cleverness of it is what annoys me. This is just classic Lou Reed, very blunt, very graphic. That's what he does. Musically, it's hard for me to say what's going on track for track because it's not a bunch of songs that are so different. It's not like your standard Metallica album. It's they're backing us and they're making mood music. They're making very heavy, high energy mood music, but it is kind of riffs and it's about textures and tones. But I mean, this is a very pummeling track. One of the kind of more disorienting ones for me, but also one of the first moments on this album. And I like this album as soon as I start it, where I'm kind of I feel like it's really locking into a mood here.
100%. I totally agree with that. And then speaking of songs that get you into the mood, we'll get into the next song here, Iced Honey. Now, this is the first song in the album that, to be honest with you, I just don't really have anything to say about. I really don't have anything to say about. It's fine.
So this is one of my favorite tracks on this album.
It's the most actual musical song on this album. It's not spoken word.
Yeah. This is one of the things where there's moments on this album where you see Metallica kind of going, like I said a little earlier, for a 70s glam rock thing. This song has kind of a big, kind of almost like a suave riff. There's something about it that feels, I don't know, almost like Rebel Rebel or something, or Walk on the Wild Side. It's kind of got a little bit of a swagger to it, but a little bit emotional. very crunching. It's a thing that still identifiably Metallica, but I don't think that they ever would have thought to go down this route if they hadn't been working with Lou Reed, which is kind of what's interesting to me about the music on this album is it's definitely Metallica. They're doing all the stuff they do good, great heavy riffs. It's definitely still metal. They're still thrash at a few points, but it's kind of like working with Lou Reed made them go down some different avenues and see how they could do it in their style. And this is, I think, one of the high points of that for me. This is one of the tracks that really pays off.
Yeah, I can agree with that for the most part. The only thing I said when I don't have really much to say about it is it's just a fine song to me. Like, I don't think it's bad or good. It's just a song that I don't really have much to comment on because the last 4 songs, there's a lot to comment on in those songs.
Yeah. Well, and lyrically, this track doesn't advance the narrative. It's kind of about a feeling.
Yes, very much so. And then speaking of tracks that carry on a feeling, let's get into the next song here, Cheat on Me. Now, this is a song that begins with the lines, why do you cheat on me? Why do I cheat on thee? Why do I cheat on me? Why do I cheat on me? So I think I know what the song's about. I think there's something about cheating involved.
And this is about how the 2020 election was stolen.
I did everything right, and they cheated on me. No.
And they cheated on me.
And the note that I have for this song is that this song sounds like a protagonist is severely depressed and trying to find meaning through having numerous sexual partners. And I also put, it's a song about a girl with BPD.
What you could say about the whole album. So, Taylor, correct me if I'm getting tracks mixed up, because like I said, the albums do sort of run together for me. Like I have thoughts on the album as a whole. So correct me if I'm getting mixed up. This is one of the Continuum heavy songs, right? Is this one of our slower, more dour kind of songs?
I believe so, yes, because from what I remember, because I just listened to this before we recorded for the second time, and it takes about a solid 2 minutes before the lyrics come in, because it is an 11 and a half minute long song. It's one of the longer songs of this album. In fact, it is actually the second longest song on the album.
So a prominent instrument on this that Taylor mentioned before is the Continuum. It's an electronic instrument. Not really sure how it works. It is used a lot in avant-garde music, and it kind of is a continuing sound of reverberation. So it just sounds like it never ends, and it kind of loops through in these different patterns. And I think this is a good point to get in. You know, I talked a little bit about White Light, White Heat and how I feel like a lot of this album is Metallica taking that kind of rough, noisy garage rock thing and saying, oh, let's fit that into the Metallica sound. Another, maybe more surprising one to people who haven't listened to this album is that I think Metallica are in earnest emulating Metal Machine music. I'm not saying that it's like a joke, like, oh, it's 2 unlistenable albums. I know I've heard people say that before. Metal Machine music is obviously it's a sound of layers of oscillators and synthesizers being added and removed to each other to make these really kind of hypnotic and disharmonious kind of noises. There's lots of squealing and lots of what sounds like sheet metal just scratching against each other and making these different kind of noises that are mostly really unpleasant, but occasionally create something really beautiful. And it goes on for 2 whole albums. And there are long stretches of tracks on this where it's Metallica, but then you've got Lou Reed on this Continuum, and you've got the band doing these strange kind of dissonant guitar things. I think that Metallica were listening to Metal Machine music before writing these songs, as funny as that is for me to imagine.
I just imagine Robert Trujillo just like head nodding, listening to it. No, like
just fighting every like muscle in his fingers to play slow enough.
As somebody who hasn't listened to Metal Machine music in a very long time and only listened to it once, I don't know if I can agree with that or not, but it makes enough sense to me that I could imagine that's possible.
I've listened to Metal Machine music a few times. I do enjoy it. I think it sounds cool, but it absolutely was made, A, because Lou Reed was on a bunch of drugs, and it was, I think, trying to express that feeling, and because he just wanted to straight up alienate his audience as much as he possibly could.
Wasn't he doing it to do a record label fucking obligation too, if I'm not mistaken?
I don't know if that's true. I've heard that, and I feel like I've even read more in depth about that, but I can't remember if I read that that was true or if it was not. My gut impulse is that that was not true. Might be. I'd have to double check.
All right, let's get into disc 2 here. Now, this next song is called Frustration, and the notes that I have here for that, while the track is sad and desperate in a fairly harmless way, it is creepy and fills me with dread. That was my note here. And once again, this could also be about Jack the Ripper. And I know I haven't mentioned it too much as we were talking about this, but all the instrumentals on this album from Metallica are fucking incredible. They're so good. They work so well, just building the tension throughout pretty much this whole album. Like, as we said earlier, like on the Saint Anger episode, Metallica are world-class instrumentalists, and they fucking bring it all in this album. They really do.
That's what's frustrating to me about hearing people say this is the worst album ever, is like, I'm not going to say Metallica are clearly not the best band to choose to do avant-garde music, but this is Metallica doing avant-garde music. It's pretty good. Like, it's about the best possible version of that. And I would say it's not just pretty listenable, it sounds pretty cool. Keep in mind, I would say I'm a much bigger Lou Reed fan overall in terms of my life than a Metallica fan. I think that Metallica are really dragging this album over the finish line. I kind of think that, in my head, what I see is Lou Reed coming in with this concept that on paper is kind of undoable, which is the avant-garde Metallica album where they're backing him. And Lou Reed might even be expecting it to be, I think, a bigger fiasco than it is. I suspect that Lou Reed is not a fan of Metallica music. But Metallica really crafted some really interesting and compelling and really heavy, creepy music to back these kind of heavy and weird lyrical concepts that Lou Reed was bringing in. And actually, I would say that frustration, but a lot of the album does fill me with a sense of unease and of dread. I think that's a really good way to put it.
No, for sure. And then speaking of dread, the next song on here, Little Dog. And this is also a great song. I mentioned to you that this is like a even somehow more like vulgarly horny Leonard Cohen song. But I also said in the notes here that I'm not entirely sure what the song is about, but I think the song might be about how Lulu herself sees her clients. Like, she describes some pretty like gross sort of sexual dynamics going on here.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think it is. I think she sees them as these inhuman little sniffing around, like their wet snouts just gathered around her, just drooling. That's exactly how I read this. It's like it's looking hatefully at like the clientele.
Okay, good. I'm glad we had the same thought. And yeah, this is just a continuation on a lot of that's going on. This one gets pretty gross. It's about a small dog with basically a little dick just going around just trying to get pussy.
This is another one with like some really funny lyrics to me. Like, I think unintentionally funny. It's hard to say because Lou Reed could be a pretty funny guy. But there's a part in here where Lou Reed keeps saying hot to trot. Or I'm sorry, hot in trot. And that's very funny. It just sounds very funny. You hear this old gay New York guy's voice going, hot and trot. It's just like, okay. I like this album, but I do see, at least in moments, why people laugh at it the way they do. This is one of my favorite tracks on this album. We're getting into like that last chunk of the album, these last 3 tracks, where I do think that it really pulls together. Not that the rest of it's bad, but it's sort of like, because this is a concept album, the album is kind of driving along and it's really starting to ramp up, both in terms of the themes and the music.
For sure. And then speaking of really bringing everything together, the penultimate song on the album, track 9, Dragon. Now, this is my single favorite song in this album.
Mine too. Yeah, absolutely.
Fucking love it. The instrumentation and just the build. It's like a horror movie. It's a horror movie soundtrack. It's fucking incredible.
Best song on the album.
100%. Yeah, I think this song could be, once again, about Jack the Ripper. And I think if it is ultimately about him just going to town on this prostitute and just murdering her horrifically and just letting all of his negative emotions and thoughts and just derangement out on this woman. And also, like, on this whole album, there's definitely a sort of ambient misogyny that kind of builds throughout a lot of this. This is where it just all comes to a fucking head. It is horrifying.
I mean, so I think we're on the same page. You think that this is the perspective of the killer viewing our protagonist, like what he thinks of her. You think you're so special. There's no law meant for you. You come and go like the goddess you are. He's like this sexual demon who's looking at this woman who he hates, who's the object of his desire. It's very creepy. It's also like probably my favorite lyrics on the album. This is really a classic Lou Reed, like dark story.
100%. Yeah. And even though it is, 11 minutes long, there's not a single part of the song that I get bored by. It is just never ending, just misery and dread that's building and building and building. And yeah, it's like, you think you're so special. It's like, oh my God.
One of the things I was thinking, I'm glad we feel the same way about this. I think similarly to how we felt about Sweet Amber. So for me, let's say that Lulu and Saint Anger as albums both don't exist. Let's say that the songs Dragon and Sweet Amber exist in a vacuum. They're like Metallica rare songs. I absolutely cannot believe when I think of that world that Metallica fans don't love these 2 songs. They might see them as weird or as different songs, but this is a really heavy song.
It is. I mean, it's fucking heavier than pretty much anything they made in the 90s. That's for goddamn
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. That's one of the other things that's crazy to me about people hating on this album. So you've got your basic mainstream Metallica fans who have made fun of plenty, but I want to reiterate, like, the hip music crowd also ragged on this album, which is so weird to me. This track in particular is a good example, but this whole album is. At the same time this album that Lulu came out, there was a thing that was starting to bubble up in the metal underground. Are you familiar with post-metal?
I've heard of it, yes.
So this is basically like that in its way. Post-metal is an avant-garde genre that grows out of black metal and death metal, uses metal kind of composition and instrumentation, but ostensibly is not about being heavy. It's about atmosphere, and the songs tend to be really long and kind of minimal and droning. And it's just funny to me. It's like Metallica and Lou Reed, by collaborating, they accidentally made a very cutting-edge metal album because it's basically like post-metal.
Interesting. Okay.
This is the track where I would take this out of the context of this album, and much like Sweet Amber, just listen to this song. I would like to say that to like fans of classic Metallica. Just listen to these two songs on their own merits.
I will agree. And I remember you mentioned on the Saint Anger episode that Sweet Amber was the one song you could possibly put on your Metallica playlist. I think if you were to put any song from Lulu on your Metallica playlist, it would be this song.
Of course. And I mean, there is an argument to be made. I don't really agree, but if someone said maybe Metallica and Lou Reed shouldn't have done a full album together, maybe they should have done a couple tracks, I wouldn't agree with that, but I would understand it. Like, maybe if someone said, you know, this was too much of a detour for Metallica to do for a whole album. I don't agree. I'm glad they did it. Because much like I think they had to make Saint Anger to survive that period, they had to make this album because I think that Lars in particular needed to make like a big art piece album. Like, I think he's wanted to forever, and I think he needed to get that legitimate art itch scratched because I think he had some real hangups about it. And I think this was important for him.
Oh, no, we definitely mentioned that the Saint Anger episode. Like, he's an art collector. He's like a fancy art guy, essentially.
And this is like, you know, he could probably have shown Lulu to his art snob dad, whose approval he always cared about. And his dad might be like, oh, this is real art.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you liked Dragon, because once again, my favorite song in the album, I think it's got some of the best instrumentation, some of the best just aggressive, angry, just building up to the ultimate misogynistic lyrics on this album.
Easily the best lyrics on the album for me.
For sure. It really comes together on this song for me in a way that all the other songs were kind of getting
They come close.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to elaborate on that on a little bit. We have one more track left, so I won't take too long. And I want to give a little bit of credit to people who did not like, or at least did not understand this album upon its release. I do think it's a hard sell. You take Lou Reed, who famously is like a very hip, very, you know, New York underground, written about in like edgy scenes and, you know, obviously a favorite of tastemakers like Lester Bangs and Kristall, and then Metallica, who I love, but for a long time were not that. In a lot of ways, their core audiences are kind of opposing. I think there's a lot more overlap there than most people understand. Obviously, a lot of people that are into punk are really into both bands, but like the stereotypical Lou Reed fan and Metallica fan opposing. And I will say there's a little bit of something about hearing his voice over their music that's kind of jarring. Like, there are two things that clearly were never originally intended to go together. I think they work, they're cool and interesting together, but most of the time you can tell they're coming from very different places, and I can see why that might put people off. But I think on Dragon, all those components come together perfectly. Metallica's heaviness and the professionalism of their playing, and then Lou Reed's kind of atonalness and his literary features, and just the darkness and starkness of his lyrics. I think on Dragon, it all comes together pretty perfectly.
Yeah, once again, I couldn't agree more. Great song. If you're willing to put a song from every Metallica album on your playlist, this is the one to do it for, 100%. Even if you don't like Lulu, you should still give this song credit because it's fucking great.
So when I make a playlist, like an overview for an artist I love, I try not to neglect any main albums that they release, even if there's an album I don't like. Because the type of nerd I am, I'm like, well, I'm making an overview for an artist. If I did that for Metallica, I would have to include at least one song from each album. And Dragon is, of course, that's the track from Lulu. If you need a summation of all of the strongest parts of the Lulu era for Metallica, even if you don't like that album, this is it.
Yeah, I fucking couldn't agree more. 100%. All right, let's get into the final track here. Now, this is also the longest song in the album. This song is nearly 20 minutes long. This is a 19 and a half minute long song. This is Junior Dad. Now, this is the song that I wouldn't say I dislike, but I have a hard time really understanding exactly where it fits into the themes of this album.
I'm going to tell you something. Like, I assume that maybe if I was familiar with the source material, that it would make more sense. I have no idea where this fits in. Having said that, the actual like concept of this album, although I understand that it's important, I think that resonates a lot more with you than it does for me. The lyrics are kind of secondary on this album to the music and the vibe. So it didn't bother me too much. But yeah, once you pointed it out, I kind of looked over these lyrics and I was like, yeah, I actually don't know how this is supposed to be a resolution to this story. But musically, I like it quite a bit. It's kind of beautiful. It reminds me a lot of a song from the Velvet Underground's first album. It's a little bit psychedelic, a little bit dreamlike. It kind of reminds me of the song Heroin. I think that's probably what Metallica are channeling on the music here. But yeah, my guess is as good as yours as to how this fits in with the plot about the degraded murder victim lady and Jack the Ripper.
The only thing I could possibly imagine is if it is related to the themes, is that it's like her final dying thoughts are like her going to heaven or something, and maybe kind of reconciling with the fact that she lived a short, brutal, miserable life, I guess.
You might be right, for all I know. At that point, we're getting so general that, like, I mean, maybe, like I said, I'm assuming that maybe if I knew about the play, I'd be like, oh, this is what this is about. But as it stands, I have no idea. But I do like the track quite a bit. I have heard, and I don't know if you read anything about this, I don't know if this is true, that apparently when they were playing back Junior Dad in the studio, Kirk and Lars started crying and hugging each other because they were so overcome with pride over how beautiful they felt this track was.
So actually, I have a excerpt from an article, and it was James and Kirk.
Even better, because James is the one that I expected to be not as interested in this.
And the reasoning for that is the specific line, apparently, and I found this on genius.com, which oftentimes have lyrics from various bands on there and annotations on what the meanings could possibly be, or even citations on like specific meanings of the lyrics. And this one had that on here with a excerpt from an article. So apparently the specific line, "Say hello to Junior Dad, the greatest disappointment, age withered him and changed him." That line apparently made James and Kirk cry. And as I believe I mentioned on the Saint Anger episode, James's dad abandoned him when he was 13 years old, died, I think sometime maybe like 10-ish years ago, around the time this album came out. So James obviously had unreconciled feelings from that. Kirk's dad actually apparently died like a couple weeks before the recording.
So it's more about a personal resonance with like the theme rather than like pride or necessarily over like the beauty of the music, which is what I thought it was.
I mean, it's literally about fathers to them.
Okay, that does clarify that.
Which, you know, it is very interesting, right? Because I don't know about Robert's family life. You know, I'm not going to make any sort of judgments on that. But of course, Lars's dad has been very intimately involved in his entire life from the seams of it. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if his dad was part of the reason why Metallica got off the ground in the first place.
Well, we don't really need to think too much about Rob's. I mean, I love Rob, great bass player. I love Suicidal Tendencies and Infectious Grooves. He is kind of a journeyman bass player in Metallica.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But I didn't want to contrast that with James because obviously James's dad had very little direct involvement in his professional life because he abandoned his family. So the fact that he never was able to really reconcile those feelings with his dad up until around the time Saint Anger came out when he finally went to therapy. And some of those feelings obviously came out while recording this album. And then also something we totally forgot to mention, actually two things. So, of course, James Hetfield just very recently, as of recording this, a week prior, celebrated his 60th birthday. So, happy 60th belated birthday, James Hetfield.
Yes, a great American rock and roll songwriter.
And also, he finally got divorced last
Boo!
year. Boo!
Party!
Oh, boo. I was saying boo. You said woo. I said boo.
Two genders.
Hell yeah, dude. But that was the wife that he wrote Nothing Else Matters about. That was the wife that he went to rehab multiple times for. That was the wife that he gave up drinking for. And here we are. Finally, James Hetfield is a divorced guy. It took a long time, but he finally became a divorced guy too.
He's still sober, as far as we know?
I think he is, yes. And I will say, give James credit. He did not follow in his father's footsteps. He did not abandon his children. He genuinely did try, from the seams of it, once again, giving up alcohol multiple times, going to rehab multiple times, going to therapy multiple times, writing multiple songs about this woman. He tried very hard to make things work.
Just by the way, interesting little fact about Nothing Else Matters. Originally intended to be for James's planned solo country album.
That makes a lot of sense.
That was a solo song. He wrote it acoustic guitar. It was not going to be a Metallica album. You know, James has for a long time wanted to do a country album. I think the time for that's kind of passed. But this was going to be a country song for his solo album that never came to be until Lars heard it and said, like, hey, this needs to be a Metallica song. I think he made the right call.
I agree. And also, like, his personal style, his sort of look to him, because I think even though, of course, James Hetfield is from LA and he's lived in California most of his life and Colorado, that's like his getaway area. But let's face it, though, James Hetfield's like aesthetically, looks wise, dress wise, he has like aggressively Midwestern aesthetics. Let's be honest here.
Yeah, no, he totally does. I kind of do feel like Lars is also a leader. James is like the leader of Metallica, but there does seem to be like a divide between him and the rest of the guys when you see them all together, where like Kirk and Lars are very clearly kind of like nerdy, pretty sensitive, like rock and roll boys. James is like a trucker or something.
Yeah.
Very workmanlike, very like, let's get out there and do it.
I looked at his photo on, I think it was IMDb, and he's literally wearing like a cowboy hat and he's got his like fucking horseshoe mustache. I'm like, yep, that's the trucker aesthetic he's going for.
Yep.
All right, but yes, that is the track listing for Lulu.
One little bit about Junior Dad. So this isn't the most interesting thing on the album. We were saying it's 19 minutes. About 10 minutes of that is the song Junior Dad, and it fades away into a bunch of feedback and continuum noises. Goes on for about 10 minutes, and the album just sort of fades away into that. Just want to call out those weird little ambient interludes because, again, I'm pretty sure that Metal Machine music is like a primary reference point for this album, and that's fascinating to me. It's just fascinating to me to imagine Metallica sitting around listening to Metal Machine music and going, oh, yeah, we could probably do something like that.
But yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. And also, one last thing I'll have to say about Junior Dad. I think it is interesting when you mentioned, like, yeah, half the song is, you know, the lyrics, not necessarily just the ambient instrumentation, and then the 10-ish minutes is instrumentation. And I find it interesting because it almost could sound like church music to a certain extent, or like orchestral.
I think it sort of is.
And it's interesting because we have to reiterate, this was the very last thing Lou Reed ever did. This was literally the last thing he ever recorded, is essentially like operatic, instrumental, almost like church music. That's kind of like symbolic, isn't it?
It's perfect because now that we're here, the Lou Reed's last album, I see Lou Reed fans sometimes and they'll kind of snidely say, oh, it's so sad that this is the last thing he did. No, this is the perfect last, because do you know what it would have been otherwise? It would have been some other Lou Reed solo album that nobody fucking listened to. That was pretty good, probably very well written, kind of like rock songwriting. That was probably very good, but didn't make the big type of statement that Lou Reed made throughout his career that he became notorious for. This album, I absolutely believe that Lou Reed knew, and he knew as soon as he approached Metallica, how divisive this would be, how much it would confuse people that he hated. And he was like, this is it. I stand by that. I think Metallica were like, yeah, we're going to make this thing for Lou Reed. We're going to work with this true artist and we're going to help him realize his vision. Whereas I think Lou Reed was like, oh, we're going to fuck with some people, because that's what he did. And I think in that regard, because you know he had so much fun watching people just fucking hate this album. People pull their hair out over it. I think the perfect final record for him in that way.
Absolutely. All right. Any final thoughts before we get into our Amazon reviews?
This is nowhere near the best Metallica album, nowhere near the best Lou Reed album, but it's pretty interesting. It sounds pretty good. I think consistently Metallica sound pretty great on it. Like, if you like Metallica's music, I can't really imagine why you'd hate this album musically. And if you're not into Lou's lyrics or his vocals, that's probably just a matter of taste. You know, some people like him, some people don't. But I find it fascinating that I don't think anyone bothered to listen to this album or really give it much thought. And I think there's a lot going on here. And it really sucks to think that there's this whole album that's such a weird piece of just pop culture that people kind of just use as gristle for their meme mill. And the other thing I want to say too, the live performance of this, pretty interesting. And I really hope if this ever gets an extended edition release, that it will include the live versions of White Light, White Heat, and Sweet Jane, because I think that goes a long way to helping understand kind of how Metallica were interpreting Lou Reed. That's Metallica covering a couple of classic Velvet Underground songs with Lou Reed on lead vocals. Pretty fun to hear. Also, just, I mean, they turn White Light White Heat into a thrash song. It's fun as hell. So check that out if you're interested in this album.
Hell yeah. So I'm going to save my final thoughts for the end of the episode, but I really want to get into these Amazon reviews. So I have one positive and one negative review, and I'll do the negative review first because this was the highest voted. Now, there was actually one that was a little bit higher upvoted than this, but it was way longer, so I didn't include that for obvious reasons because I don't want to hear 10 paragraphs of somebody being annoying. So I'll do 2 paragraphs of somebody being annoying. So Jay Loudon gives this 1 star, and the head of the review says, "Not what you were expecting." And the body of the review says, "Metallica fans, before you get too excited at the prospect of a follow-up to 2008's Death Magnetic, please know that this is in no way a Metallica album. Lou Reed fans, before you begin to think your favorite member of the Velvet Underground has finally gotten off his concept album kick following his 4-track ambient meditational album, Hudson River Wind Meditations, please know that he is not. When Lou Reed and Metallica first announced they would be collaborating for a full album, imaginations of fans ran wild. Metallica is easily one of the most successful and influential metal acts of all time, and Lou Reed's work with the Velvet Underground created his legacy as both a songwriter and musical innovator. Their combined efforts had to result in something extraordinary, right? Wrong. Even in his prime, Lou Reed was never much of a vocalist. As a songwriter, he ranks among the best, but his voice is not the reason his albums sell. At 69 years of age, his voice has only gotten worse, and it shows on Lulu. For 87 minutes, what Lou Reed does on Lulu could rarely be classified as singing. In fact, most of the time, Lulu sounds like a cross between a drunken rant and the mumbles of a crazy person talking to himself. To be honest, I'm not convinced it isn't literally a combination of these two things. The concept of Lulu is basically Lou Reed taking on the persona of a young woman who has had terrible experiences with men and decides to give out a drawn-out monologue. The creepiness of a 69-year-old man playing the part of a young woman aside, Metallica's backdrop feels terribly out of place. Their trademark guitars still create a staggering wall of sound, but the energy of each chord quickly dies as they're sustained through Reed's banter. It's obvious neither Lou Reed nor Metallica truly care what people think of this record. Lulu is a musical experiment by a group of artists that can afford to do it, nothing more. The unfortunate side effect is that it punishes the most loyal fans who blindly purchase the album expecting greatness. For those of you who pre-ordered Lulu, as soon as you heard about it, I'm sorry to say it isn't even worth listening to once. Take the album, stick it in your blender, and press the liquefy button. You'll be doing your ears a favor. At least the dreadful noise created by that should only last 20 seconds or so. Now, I will say, I disagree with pretty much all of this review, except for the parts where, he's describing, obviously, Lulu's experiences. That's true. But this is the reason I like this album, because it is abrasive. It is not friendly to Metallica fans.
Well, the other thing that's weird about it, too, is maybe I'm overly generous with stuff like this. It's hard to imagine an artist doing an album that is like this confrontational and this much of like a big statement and just saying it's terrible. Because it takes some sort of vision, I feel like, to do stuff like that. So like, I'd still rather listen to this than just like a boring record, like something by Deep Blue something,
And I will say, to give this person credit, even though they did give this a pretty negative review, it seems like this person at least listened to the album, so I'll give them credit for that, unlike most Metallica fans who, once again, just literally saw the I am the table meme and just gave up. They didn't even try. So even if you don't like this album, or if you do like this album, it's like Saint Anger. Just give it a fucking chance.
I would say if you aren't a fan of like either of these artists, you probably don't need to. But my feeling is like, if you're a Metallica fan, if you like Metallica's work post Black Album and you're open to that, then I can't really imagine why you'd hate the music on this album. It's very solid.
It is fantastic. I would argue it's probably some of the best instrumentation they've done in the last couple of decades. It's amazing.
I mean, I kind of think that too. I like a lot of like avant-garde rock and stuff. And I know this isn't like the best example of it, but I probably am a little bit more predisposed to stuff like that than like a big Metallica fan tends to be. But no, I think the instrumentation on this is great. I think it is simple, which is one of the criticisms I hear of it, but that's because it's backdrop music. It's to showcase the lyrics.
100%. So that was the best negative review I could find, because this was, once again, pretty much the only person that actually tried listening to this album. So I'll give them that. Let's get into a positive review here. So this one is from Grigory's Girl, who gives this 5 stars. And the header of the review says, masterpiece, period. Listen to it again, Metallica fans. And the body of the review says, this is a masterpiece, one of Lou Reed's finest achievements, and one of the most unique albums in rock and roll history.
I mean, as someone who really likes Lou Reed, I gotta say, it's not.
Metallica fans, who almost uniformly despise this album, didn't seem to get that it's a Lou Reed album first and a Metallica is backing him. It's an avant-garde heavy metal album which seemed to confuse Metallica fans and the public at large. This is not a piece of shit. It's a work of genius. It's extremely profound and thought-provoking. It was also Lou's last official album, and it's a hell of a way to go out for the legendary rock and roller.
I also don't know if I think it's that profound.
Metallica, in parentheses, who I'm a huge fan of, has expressed some regrets for this album, but they shouldn't. They have absolutely nothing to be ashamed of here. Every song is memorable. The performances are top-notch, and it's something that gets better upon repeated listenings. I agree with a lot of this review, but your interjections I completely agree with. I'll be honest. Those are the only points that I disagree with.
My whole reason for wanting to review this, the same as you want to do Saint Anger, is I want to revisit it and really dig into it beyond, the jokes people make about it. I find this album very interesting, and I think the music on it's really cool. I actually think Dragon is a really good song where all of these pieces come together in a really cool way. But I wouldn't say this is a masterpiece for either of these bands, especially bands who have had heights as great as Lou Reed and Metallica both have separately. This is not their masterpiece.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this person, even though I agree with them more than I disagree with them, I think they're trying to be purposefully contrarian.
Yeah, they feel like they need to head off some of the unfair criticisms by it being hyperbolic in the opposite direction, maybe?
Yeah, no, 100%. The thing is that we're not saying this is a perfect album by any stretch of the imagination, but just like Saint Anger, it is an audacious, fucking abrasive album that is not very commercially friendly. And that's a thing that is very brave of a band of Metallica's fucking caliber to do, because they could just release the fucking Black Album for their entire career, and everyone would just be like, oh, this is Metallica. They're the band that are just going to make the same music over and over and over again.
And you know what? If you want to review media, if you feel like you enjoy music or film or art and you have stuff to say about it and you want to really look into it, guess what? If you're going, this thing is bad, so I'm not going to listen to it because I don't like it, or this thing is good because I like it and I don't want to listen to it, it's fine to consume media that way, but then you're not a good critic. You aren't thoughtful about the media you're consuming. I just see that a lot with both of these albums, and it annoys me because that's not reviewing something. That's not looking at what something is. And that's why I wanted to do this album and why I think we want to do Saint Anger, is because we want to say, hey, these albums haven't really gotten much of an actual critical viewing.
Yeah, no, 100%. And the last thing I really want to say, shitting on Metallica fans, is in the chat earlier, I think it was yesterday, and I mentioned this a little bit on the Saint Anger episode, but I think there's a pretty solid one-to-one comparison you can make between Star Wars fans and Metallica fans. They're basically the same kind of people, especially the diehard fans are the same kind of people. Let's be real here. They're fucking entitled. They seemingly don't understand the reason why their respective artists make the decisions that they make. They're resistant to any kind of change or experimentation. They're disgusting consumers, like the fucking consumer meme. I mentioned this to you, but I have an even better allegory. I bet you if the members of Metallica, particularly James and Lars and George Lucas, they had their fucking monkey's paw moment. And it's hey, you could be the most successful whatever at your specific genre, but you have the most annoying fans in the world. And that was their monkey's paw thing. Fucking George Lucas can't go out in public without somebody being like, you ruined my childhood. Or fucking James or Lars can't go out in fucking LA or whatever without somebody being like, yo, fucking Load and Reload suck, dude, but fucking Master of Puppets rocks. That is their existence, but they get to be 100 billionaires.
I think they are unbothered.
I feel like they're probably unbothered by it now, but there was a point where they were absolutely fucking seethingly mad about it. I know that for a fact. Especially George Lucas, obviously, around the time that the prequels came out. And then, of course, with Metallica, around the time that Load and Reload. And then, of course, obviously, with the nadir of their career, at least from a fan perspective, as Saint Anger.
I have no real proof of this. I don't see the same sort of reactionary hate from Metallica fans that I do from the weird Star Wars fans. The kind of basic purist Metallica fans, they seem kind of boring and kind of like they're just stuck listening to the same 4 albums over and over again. But the Metallica fans, and I don't know a lot about that community, they seem really volatile and weird about it.
They are 100%. And I will agree with that for the most part. I think the only thing that when we were talking earlier is that if Lulu came out this year, I bet you a lot of Metallica fans would call it woke for whatever reason.
Which is funny because, I mean, you could call Lou Reed in a lot of ways progressive. He, of course, one of his best albums is 1989's album New York, which is very political. And I don't know if you'd call it leftist, but yeah, progressive. But like, I would not call Lou Reed at any time like a quote unquote woke guy.
No, 100%. But that's the thing, though, right? Is that with a lot of reactionary minded people, and yeah, Metallica fans aren't as reactionary as Star Wars fans.
Well, it's anything that's really, really popular to a broad, popular American base is going to be reactionary to some degree.
Exactly. And even though woke never had a distinct meaning, woke is one of those words that has just had so much definitional creep, it's not even funny. Anything is woke.
Anything I don't like is woke.
But yeah, I think there is a certain amount of similarity between it. Not a complete one-to-one comparison, but I would say it's a fairly accurate one-to-one comparison between Star Wars and Metallica fans.
And I think I said this to you in the chat. The reason for both of those groups is because what they're really mad about is that a new Star Wars movie or a new Metallica album can't make them feel like they felt in 8th grade when it came out and they heard it for the first time. That's what they're really mad about. That it can never be that way again.
God, abso-fucking-lutely. I totally agree with that. All right, so it is getting late as shit. I have to go to bed because I'm an old-ass millennial with creaky joints. So, Brian, before we sign off here, do you have any final thoughts?
Not just Metallica fans, but metalheads in general. Eat shit, you're stupid, you don't know how to listen to music, you don't know how to talk about music. I don't even know what the fuck you listen to other than like the first Exodus album. You all like to say Exodus are the best thrash metal band and Megadeth aren't in the big four. Nobody listens to the bands you listen to. They fucking suck. Cut your fucking hair. Lulu and Saint Anger are better than any other Metallica albums. Eat my fucking ass.
God damn, that's exactly what I thought too. But no, in all honesty, like people who have extremely knee-jerk reactions to both Saint Anger and Lulu, just sit down. I understand it's probably difficult for you to listen to anything post 1985, but I promise you, if you give this a chance, just take it out of the context of whatever memes you saw about it. Just listen to it, and maybe your perspective will change. Open your mind a little bit. Realize that just because you have an established thing that you like, there are other things out there that have quality that you may not even have heard of yet or even given a chance.
I don't even give a shit. If someone doesn't like this album or Saint Anger, I can understand why someone might not. But like, maybe don't let your like taste be dictated by fucking memes.
Couldn't fucking agree more.
If you're a fan of Metallica and you're interested in them, like I sincerely doubt that very many Metallica fans have bothered to listen to this album at this point, just because I see so little actual discussion of the music on it.
I completely agree. I would say that if I'm doing a rough estimate, 95% of Metallica fans who hate this album are only aware of the memes, have maybe listened to The View, but that's it. I guarantee you they did not listen to anything else beyond that.
They might have listened to Brandenburg Gate.
Maybe. But I guarantee you they didn't get all the way to fucking Dragon or Junior Dad.
Which, like, this is a daunting album. I get why people wouldn't like it. But also, it's very in line with Lou Reed, with what he does, both conceptually and in a lot of ways musically. And I would say, too, if you're a Lou Reed fan and you're like, you think this Metallica album is like trash and it's not up to the level of his artistry, I would say look at this as like a sequel to White Light, White Heat and Metal Machine Music. Because I think that's what it is for Lou Reed, basically.
Absolutely. So yeah, Brian, I am very glad that you recommended this album to listen to because I had just heard many things about this album. I never was like, oh, Lulu's terrible, because obviously I never listened to it. I never gave it a chance. But I can tell you, if it wasn't for this episode, I probably wouldn't have listened to it on my own just because of all the negative publicity to it.
Same with me and Saint Anger when you suggested we do that.
No, for sure. Exactly. And it's one of those things where I'm really glad that we're coming on the bandwagon of people reappraising Saint Anger. And I feel like we're going to be some of the first people on the boat to reappraising Lulu.
Legit, I got this album when it came out, and I remember thinking at the time, I don't get what's so bad about it. I think parts of it sound pretty cool. And I didn't care enough to really get out there and defend it and argue about it, but I've never understood why this album gets the hate it gets.
I don't either. So to the audience at home, don't hate, try to relate, and listen to this album.
I hate all kinds of shit. maybe like hate it because you hate it and not just because it's easy to make a post about.
Yeah, God, I couldn't agree more. All right. So, yep, let's sign off here. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on X.com. But no, you can follow me at Twitter.com. I will never call it X.com, no matter how much Elon Muskie boy tries to make me call it X. I will never call it X.
You can follow me on Twitter at JONSTABB, or you can follow me on Blue Sky at JLO Biafra, JLO Biafra, Biafra. I have 2 followers on Blue Sky, but I'm going to try to make that my primary place for updating podcast and podcast related discussion. So get on there if you listen all the way to this part of the episode.
Hell yeah. And I'm sorry, Brian, you said Blue Sky?
Blue Sky.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.